lists. Lists are a type of collections in Python. Right, now let's look at how to basically create a list, right? Lists you can just create by making 2 square brackets, and in those square brackets you could put all the data types you want, and that would be counted as a list. So I could just put a string in this list, right? And I could put an integer like 2. I could put a float like 3.5. I could put a boolean value like true, okay? So these are all things that you can put in a list, right? A list is very convenient. But you have to, whenever you're creating a list, you can't just create a list like this, right? Because it will give you an error. When I run this, it will give me an error. Right, when I say error, it doesn't actually pop up in the console, but if I wanted to access an element in that list or even print that list, I can't do it from another line of code. So I would have to only go here and print it, right? So that would not be counted as a list. But to actually create a list and access it from wherever you want, you need to save it in a variable like you normally would. Now let's make a variable called list and then set that equal to the list that we just created. Okay, so that's your list now created and saved in a variable. Now you can access it from here. So you can just say print list and run this. It would print the list. But there's one thing to remember. Some people think that you need to name the list's variable name as list. You don't need to do that. You can just say any old name like var. It would print, okay, let me just say this, var, and it would print that list just like that. So you don't have to ever save the variable name just like a list, because that's your choice, right? So now let's look at how to actually access a specific element in a list. So let's just say I wanted to access 3.5, right? I can't do that right now because it would show me all the values in that list, but it would not show me my specific value that I want, right? So to do that, you use index. Now index is nothing but when you have a list, right? Let's just say you're printing something, you're printing the list, and beside the list you would have to put 2 square brackets, right? And in the square brackets you would put your index. First of all, let's understand how index works. So indexing is when you're giving each element in your list a number, right? So it starts from 0 and goes to the maximum amount of elements in your list. So if it was string 2, 3.5 and true, the first element would be counted as 0 because Python always starts from the number 0. So it would name the first element as 0. The second element, which is 2, it would name it as the index 1. The third element, which is 3.5, it would be indexed as 2, right? That would be the index number. So you get it now, right? So what you have to do is, if you're trying to access 3.5, you would start from 0 in the list. So 0 is string. Then you would go to the second element, which is 1, and that's an integer. But what we want is 3.5, which has the index of 2, so you would put 2 here. And when you run this, it will say 3.5. Now you can access a specific element in a list, right? So go over that again if you don't understand, quite get it, but that is really important to understand, otherwise you will get confused in lists. Okay, now let's move on to actually editing the list. When I mean editing the list, we're going to try and add on something to the list. We can try to insert something, we can try to remove something, we can pop the list, and we can clear them, and there's many more. Right, first let's look at how to add something to a list. So to add something to this list, what I'm going to do is use something called append. Append is a method which is mostly used in collections to add something onto a list, right? Most of the time. So let me show you what I mean here. So list right here, we've created a list, and to add something onto the list, first we have to mention what we're trying to add on to, which is a list, right? And we have to specify a variable name where the list is stored in, which is list. So we say list, and then you have to say dot, and then you can put the method's name that you want to access so that you can do your action. So for adding something on, we know that it's append, so you put append there, and it will show you a suggestion as long as you're using Python. And in this append, you could put whatever you want to append. That could be a string, integer, whatever. You have to pass it as an argument in that method's brackets or parentheses. So if I wanted to add something like Python, a string, right, I would just say list.append Python, right? And now I can just, once I do that, that's when I run this, it appends on Python to the list. So it adds Python to the list. And when I print this list, right under here, so when I say list, print list, when I rerun this, as you can see, it says Python in the list as well. Now, one thing about append, it always, whatever element you add to the list, right? For example, here in Python, when you add Python to the list, it always adds it onto as the last element in that list. If you look here, when I'm adding Python, it added it as the last element in that list. But how to change that, right? So what if you wanted to add Python in a specific place in a list, right? So let's just say you want it as the second index in your list. So when if you were to access it, whenever you say Python list second as the index and run this, you should get Python, right? So how do you do that? This is where you can use insert. So insert lets you tell the method, so insert lets you actually choose where you want to add this particular data type, right, that you want to add. So you just say list dot insert. Insert is also a method, and you do the function syntax, which is parentheses, and in these parentheses you have to pass in two arguments. The first argument is where you want to add whatever you're about to add. So let's just say I want to add it as a second index, and you have to put comma and then to separate the whatever you just want to add. So I wanted to add Python, so I put Python next to it, and now I can actually make Python being the second index in my list. So let me show this to you. So where do I want the index to be? 2, and then I have to put comma. So whatever place you want it to be in your list, you have to mention that number just like that. Now it has to be an integer. It can't be a float, boolean, or a string, or any other data type. It has to be an integer. And no particular syntax, just an argument. So 2 comma, and then whatever you want to add, which is Python. So you put string and Python, and just like that, you can add Python to your list in the second index. So now if I were to print this list, I would get Python in the second index. So it would be as the third element in my list, just like that, as you can see. So you could change this to whatever you like. You could make this the first element, just like that, and then when you run this, it will be the first element in your list. So that's how you can actually choose where you want to add something into your list. Now let's go back to our original list. And what we're going to do now is look at how to remove something from a list, right? So how to remove something is very simple. It's in the name. The function, the method that we're going to use is called remove itself. So you just type in remove and it will show you the suggestion, and you have to say list.remove, right? And then you have in the methods parentheses, you have to pass whatever you want to remove as an argument. So if I wanted to remove string in my list, right, I would just say string. So you can't specify the index to remove it. You have to specify the value itself. So if it was string I wanted to remove, I would have to copy and paste exactly here. And when I run this, it will remove string from my list. And now let's print my list. And hopefully it actually only has integers and booleans and floats in my list. Just like that, you were able to remove a string from your list. You can do the same to integers as well. So let's just say I wanted to remove 2. I would just do that and run this, and as you can see, 2 is now removed from my list. Okay, so that's how you can remove something from a list. Now let's look at how to add one or more than two elements onto a list, right? So how do you do that? So this is where you use a method called extends. So what extends does is, in the method's parentheses, you have to pass another list as an argument, and in that list you would put in whatever you want to add, which is more than 2 items. So you could put a string, whatever you want, and what it would do is take that list that you sent as an argument and add that onto the list that is there already, and then combine them into one big list, right? So it's like when you add 2 strings together, it combines them both into one string, right? So this is where the extends does the same thing with a list. So it takes 2 big lists and turns them into one list. So let's look at how to do that. So I just say list.extend, and in this method's argument, as an argument, we need to pass another list. So we automatically make square brackets, and in these square brackets, we have to put whatever we want to add. So let's just say I want to add Python, and I also want to add the number 4, and I want to add also a boolean false, right? So I want to pass those, I want to add those onto my list. So when I run this, it will work. So now let me print this. Let me print the list now, and hopefully there should be all the elements that I used in the extend method. Just like that, I have got a huge list now, right? Isn't that amazing? I was able to add more than 1 or 2 elements in a list. Now there's one last method which has got something to do with remove, right? So what it is that there's a method called pop. So using pop, you can specify whatever you want to remove, and so instead of actually specifying the value itself, you can specify the index where you want to remove it. So in remove's case, right, when you say remove, the method remove actually removes the value, so you have to specify the value. So if you didn't know the value of, or the value is too long, you can specify the index, and then it will remove that index, the index's value, right? So if I said list and dot, I have to say pop, and you don't have to pass an argument here. So if you leave that blank, what it will do is actually pop the last element in my list, right? So let me just set my list to normal, right? Let me just set my list to normal again. So my list is now back to normal, right? So if I printed my list, I would have nothing that I added on. So this is my list. Let me show you. So this is my list. It's back to the original form. So if I say list.pop without passing any argument, it will not give me an error. What it would do is actually remove the last element in my list. So it would remove that boolean true, right? So when I run this and actually print it now, when I print this list, oops, and run it, it will only show me those 3 elements, but it won't show me true because that's the last element, and pop, without passing any arguments, removes the last element in my list. So instead of removing the last element in your list, let's just say you wanted to remove a specific element. So let's just say I wanted to remove 2 in my list, right? So if I wanted to remove 2, that has a particular index to it, which is index 1, right? So what I would do is just make square brackets, and in this, I would just pass whatever index I want to remove, okay? But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that, right? It's even more simple, right? You can just, instead of making all those square brackets or anything like that, you can just pass the number that you want what you want as your index, and you don't even have to make these square brackets, which it gets quite complicated. So you just have to pass the number of the index's number, and then when you run this, it will pop that element. So when I print it, it should hopefully not show me the number 2 anymore. Just like that, doesn't show me number 2. Isn't that easy, right? It's more easy than accessing any other index, because we know that if we want to access an index, we have to put the list's name, and then beside it we have to make square brackets and put the number in. But with pop, you just pass the integer directly into the method's arguments, right? So that's about lists. The lists are very interesting, and just like that, we were able to apply so many functions, and there's so many more. What I want you to do is actually not practice the methods I've told you, and also what I want you to do is say list dot, and it will show you all the methods that you can apply to a list, right? So what I want you to do is experiment with all these methods, try to look at how to use them all, and actually I'm gonna tell you one more very important method, right? It's a very simple method. It's called clear. And what it does, you can see it right here. What it does is actually clears everything in a list. So it removes every element. So if I run this first and print it, right? So let me print it. So let me print list. And when I run this, it clears list. So it just shows me an empty list. So just like that, you can experiment with this stuff. You can, if you don't know what arguments you have to pass in it, you can just say list dot, and it will show you what arguments you have to pass in it. So it says you have to pass an object or an index or whatever you like that. You can experiment with it. So that's how you can access a list. Right. Now, before we end this video. I know I keep on saying I'm ending the video, but there's one more really important thing, right? It's about to do with the indexes, right? So if I wanted to print the list, but I wanted to print, let's just say I wanted to print from 2. So I'll leave string and I want to print from 2. So I want to print 2, 3.5 and true. From 2, I would say list dot, and there's a method for this, right? It's called nothing, right? The method doesn't have a name to it, right? All you have to do is, if you want to specifically print a list but from a specific index, all you have to do is just put the list name in the print, and then you have to make some square brackets like normal, and then what you have to do is wherever you want the lists to start printing from, you have to put that index there. So if I wanted to start from 2, I would put 1 as the index, and then you have to put colon, and then when you run this, it will print everything from that number from that index you specified. Now you can also tell it where to end. So I could tell it to end at 3.5. So I'll put the index as 2, and it would only print 2 and 3.5. I mean 2 only, because we said the limit is 2. But if you were to say the limit is 3 as the index, it would print 2 and 3.5, just like that. Isn't that amazing? Right. So now the video is finished, and in this video we learned about lists.